So there's different types of potentials shown here. It's kind of an overview of where we've been and where we're going. We talked about nervous tissue, and we talked about the resting membrane potential. It said that the neuron can either be in one of two states. It's either like rest or stimulated, and so that's number one, resting potential. 2, 3, and 4 are like different conditions of excitement for the cell. We'll start off with graded potentials, which may lead to threshold potential. Ultimately, if the cell is going to be stimulated, it needs an action potential. So the goal is to stimulate this cell to get an action potential so it can stimulate the next cell in this series. Okay. So 2, 3, and 4 are conditions of excitement. So what we did maybe a blueprint in your head. The resting potential we talked about last time, we just quizzed on it. The number is -70. The cell is negative inside with respect to outside. That potential is caused by, well, basically the non-gated lead channels. The term non-gated is used because there is no gate. Remember, a channel is a pore. There's just a hole in it. It's always open, and it leaks specific things, either potassium or sodium. There's no gate. Now this is the condition of rest. It's called resting potential. The other ones are conditions of stimulus, okay? You stimulate the cell, you can have graded potentials. Meaning they can be strong or weak or medium. Like what if I gave you all the same grade on lecture exam 3? I'm going to give you all a 70. Some of you make you happy because you got a 60. Some of you are upset because you got a 90. I'm just giving you all the same grade. And you can't do that. Same thing with this. There's no one grade. There's different grades. It depends how much you jolt the cell. Okay, that's what graded means. So these can be, weak to strong. And if it's strong enough, you might trigger an action potential. That's the key. All right, so these, you need something, you've heard of this before. The ACHR, you've heard of that. That was on the previous test. And that's what we're going for here. These are dependent upon those ligand-gated channels binding the ACH, and then you let sodium influx. So these depend upon ligand-gated. ACHR, okay, you heard those channels. And if those do trigger an action potential, that's the form of stimulus that will propagate and stimulate the next cell. And that's what I'll get to by the end of today's lecture. Well, actually, I skipped threshold. You must reach threshold. The idea of threshold is, what's the minimum stimulus that will trigger an action potential? What's the minimum depolarization you got to get to? The minimum stimulus is coming from number 2. You're zapping it, giving it some juice, and if it's big enough, you reach this idea of this threshold potential, okay? What's rest? The number for rest, negative 70. If you make the inside a little more positive, if you get it to a certain threshold, maybe negative 60 millivolts, or maybe the negative 55, do you see how a less negative number, the inside of the cell, is more positive? If you reach a certain positivity inside the cell, you might trigger voltage-gated channels to open. If you do that, you're going to get your action potentials. So this might be enough, that might be the threshold to stem the voltage-gated channels. So again, what is getting you a little more positive? Which kind of channels? It's not the leak. Yeah, these ligand-gated ones that are letting in the sodium. If enough of these open to get you to some positivity, you'll open the voltage-gated channels, and that'll get you to number 4, action potential. If you reach threshold, the cell reaches threshold, you get action. I frequently abbreviate action potential AP. And AP is triggered, right? And the thing that drives the action potential, how it propagates down the axon, is illustrated on the picture. It's the voltage-gated channels for sodium and potassium. V-gated sodium, potassium channels. Talked about these before too in the muscle lecture. I'll unpack them a little more today. Anyways, that's kind of an overview. Rest, then stimulated, okay? Graded potentials, if you reach threshold, you get an action potential. Here's the picture of different channels. These two pictures show the ligand-gated channels. What's the ligand? The yellow ball. What's the yellow ball? Neurotransmitter, usually ACH, something like that. But what does it transmit? Not ACH. ACH is the ligand that opens the gate. See how the gate is closed? It's not really a gate as you think of a gate, like a fence. It's closed here, open here. It allows the influx of sodium. They say it allows the efflux of potassium too. Focus on the influx of sodium. You're making the cell more positive on the inside. So that's, I call it ligand gated. Sometimes they call it chemically gated. Okay, so that's causing the graded potentials. Now, slide the slide over a little bit. There's the voltage-gated channels. Talk about those today. Okay, so what opens the gate in the voltage-gated channel? Well, for a ligand-gated channel, a ligand opened the gate. For a voltage-gated channel, what I said in a previous lecture is a change in voltage will open the gate. Okay, so that's why they show the positivity, negativity across the cell membrane. Now, when the gate is closed, this is the condition of rest. Notice how the inside of the membrane is negative with respect to the outside. That's our negative 70. But if you get some kind of local current, some depolarization, maybe negative 60, and there's enough positive charge that travels to this molecule, that'll open the gate. So that change in voltage opened the gate, not a ligand, okay? It's not a channel, it's not always open. You need to open that channel, and then that'll give you your action potential. So those are the two different kinds of channels I'm going to focus on today. And here's a picture of, well, graded potentials I'm going to talk about first, then action potentials. And graded potentials are shown here. This is already in your notes, actually. It might be good to write it down again if you forgot. There are 3 places where a presynaptic neuron can synapse onto a postsynaptic neuron. And they're listed on this slide again. So I'm writing, there are 3 places to synapse onto a postsynaptic neuron. I'm not going to draw it again, I already did that. You can try to stimulate this cell by synapsing onto the cell body, onto a dendrite, or onto the axon hillock. Okay, those are the 3 places, and I list them here. And so therefore, this cell, based on how I'm describing things, is this the presynaptic or the postsynaptic cell? Pre or post, this is the post. Therefore, what's the pre? That's the presynaptic, that's the presynaptic, that's the presynaptic. They're synapsing onto this cell, trying to stimulate it. Now this cell actually might fire and synapse onto another cell, making that the presynaptic. So it depends your frame of reference. If I'm talking about this synapse, that's the presynaptic, this is the postsynaptic. Depends what synapse I'm talking about. But the synapses are on here, trying to get this to fire. It's like trying to get enough of a jolt to push all that positivity to here. Why here? Because what's the axon? The area of input or output? Output. So you want, this is where the voltage gated channels are, right here. So if you can push enough positivity, it's like you have a cell. Here's your area of output, right there. You're trying to get enough positive juice. You're trying to push that positivity and travel to here. X marks the spot. Because if you can trigger those voltage-gated channels in the axon to fire, you'll get your big spike, and the nerve impulse will propagate all the way down. All right, so graded potentials, they bind, I should say, ligand gated channels. Kind of messed up my thought. It's the ligand gated channels that arrow up here bind neurotransmitters, and that's what's shown there. And what we're going to focus on is once they do that, the gate opens and you allow sodium influx. So they open, allow sodium influx. And we call that a depolarization. Okay, depolarization. Because if you have a cell membrane, and on the outside it's positive, right, I mentioned this before, you have a separation of charge, negative 70, that's polarized. All the positive on the outside, negative on the inside. If you depolarize it, you're allowing the positives in. That's what's shown there. If positive gets in, you're depolarizing this condition. Now, notice you have ion flow across the cell membrane. Notice you have ion flow within the cell membrane. And what I don't like about this figure is they should put these arrows on the inside, not the outside. Imagine you're a positive ion, you got in. That's ion flow across the cell membrane. But then once you get in, you look around, for example, oh, it's negative there. I'm attracted to negative. So I want to go to where the negatives are. That's current flow on the inside. So you also have ion flow along the inside of the cell membrane too. Whenever ions are flowing, whether it be across the cell membrane or along the inside of the cell membrane, that's considered current. Currents are ions flowing. Consider that current. Either ions flowing across or ions flowing in. So when they draw those purple arrows out from the ligand-gated channel, they're trying to illustrate the current flowing along the surface of the cell membrane. Now here's a picture of what happens to kind of stop the graded potential. You already know it. You degrade the neurotransmitter with like a ACH, acetylcholine esterase or something. Okay, that's something you already know. I don't want to spend time talking about that. This is what I want to talk about. I want to get you thinking like you're in the lab and you're measuring these currents on a cell prep. We're not going to do this wet lab, but I at least want to get the idea across. What does it look like when you see a graph of it? Can you interpret it? Okay. So I'm drawing here on the board what's happening. You're letting positive in, and we call it depolarization. That's what it looks like. That's a graded potential, what it looks like on the graph. So here's some graded potential characteristics. Let's kind of take a laundry list of what I've already said and some things I haven't said yet. First of all, what kind of channel is responsible for them? Is it the leak, the ligand gated, or the voltage gated? Those three. That's the multiple choice. It's the ligand gated. Okay. Okay, so we talked about that. What they are, as shown here, they're kind of like very small changes in membrane potential. I call them like teeny-weeny depolarizations or hyperpolarizations. They're small changes in membrane potential. It doesn't change very much. Okay. Now, also, I said, what's the property of graded potentials? Well, they're graded. They can be big or small. Think about these kinds of potentials. You can add them up. They can summate. And we'll get, that's kind of like at the very, very end of the lecture. You can add, like for example, maybe that teeny-weeny depolarization isn't enough to reach threshold, but what if you had like 2 of those and you added them up? Maybe that's enough positivity to get you to threshold. So that's the idea, they can summate. Another characteristic is they're decremental. That means they die fast. You give a little jolt, it's like it travels not very far. Okay. Maybe if you you zap it, put a little influx there, and maybe travels out just a little bit in all directions. Maybe it travels a little bit more, but it's dying really fast. So I'm making all these concentric circles around where the positive influx is, because it goes through the cell membrane, and then it goes along the inside of the surface, so it kind of travels out. It's kind of like the analogy is given, you take a stone and throw it in a still pond of water, and it causes water ripples. The water ripples are strongest where the rock hit the water, but then they die out fast. That's kind of like what this is. All right, so let me explain literally what's going on in that little blip there. In a depolarization, the inside of the cell is becoming more positive or less negative, however you want to think of it. So that's what I'll play. Inside of the cell becomes more positive. So you stimulate it, the ligand-gated channels open, you get sodium influx. Let me take it a step back. Before you stimulate it, what should be the resting membrane potential? What's the number? You rest, then stimulate it, sodium influx. Maybe it takes you a little bit away from negative 70, maybe negative 65 or something. I'll just kind of throw a number out there. You became more positive on the inside. You became less negative. Okay, and let's say that that's it. You don't reach threshold. I point to this little blip where it goes down. Then you repolarize. This is depolarized. Depol. But then, if you return to negative 70, that's a repolarization. You go from here to here. You return to rest. Now, sodium influx usually causes the depol. The repol is typically caused by a potassium efflux. So let me put that over this arrow. Because to become a little more positive to back to a little more negative, positive potassium left to cause that. Okay, so that's basically what you have there. You could do the opposite thing. This, okay? Well, instead of a little bump, it's a little crater. This would be called hyperpolarization. Now the inside of the cell is becoming less positive, more negative. Inside of the cell. I'll say more negative. If we're at rest, negative 70, and the stimulus actually opens channels that allow not sodium influx, but potassium efflux, potassium leaving, that takes us to a more negative number. I'll call it negative 75. Okay, I call that the hyperpolarization. And then so to allow you to return to negative 70, maybe it's a little bit of sodium leaking in. So you just get more negative, more positive. That's the basic idea of a graded potential. Okay, which one brings you closer to threshold? The dipole or the hyperpole? Which one brings you closer? The dipole does. You want to get positive enough to trigger an action potential, negative 55, negative 60, something. Maybe this implies it's, I don't know, maybe, they don't say what threshold's going to be, but maybe it's negative 50. Okay, look, before we get to action potential, here's another way. I kind of like these slides. It's from a different textbook. But they show the ligand-gated channels, and they show them closed, and they show the voltmeter here. Here's the positive once they get in, but it can't unless a ligand binds. Okay? That's kind of what I like about that. And then they show it binding here. What color are the balls that are the ligands in this illustration? They're the red balls. Do you see the positive charges entering the cell? Yeah. And now our membrane potential has changed. What was it before? It was minus 70, now it's negative 65, okay? And now they show those ions, now it's inside, and they kind of travel along the inside of the surface there. And they call that a local current. The positives that influxed now travel to neighboring membrane. It's negative 60 here. When you travel to this place, it depolarizes to negative 65. And here it still rests, negative 70. Okay. So you got that local current that's traveling along the inside. That's a graded potential. The goal is to get enough of this to trigger an action potential. Here's how the Marriott book looks at it. You can poke a cell and that will stimulate it. So where they poke it and it's red, you get your stimulus, your influx. And then once inside, that positive charge, it can travel in both directions. Here's another way to look at it. This is a graded potential. Okay. Where did the rock hit the water? Where it's highest. Depolarized from negative 70 the most here. The active area where you have the ligand-gated channels open. But this is kind of illustrates the property of, I erased it, decremental. What did I mean when I said decremental? I used the analogy of water ripples. This is it. It's like, it doesn't say stay strong as you go away from it. It dies fast. Okay, that's why you may not reach threshold. You have to have enough of a jolt. Okay, so that's graded potential. So that's kind of like the end of graded potentials. I'm going to transition into action potential now. It's the next set of slides for those of you who print the slides out. I inserted some pictures, like not from any textbook, but just I want to give students an appreciation of where the research comes from. These guys. Sometimes students, most of you are nursing students, you get frustrated, why do I have to learn about action potential? I remember my mom took anatomy in the 60s, and she gave me her anatomy book from the 60s. And I was reading through it, it's like, wow, this is all the same. You know what's different? There's no action potential. They didn't have the cell physiology knowledge that we have now. So if you don't want to learn action potential, you want to be a nurse from the 60s. That's the knowledge you want to have. That's kind of what I think to myself. It's like, okay, yeah, you're right. You probably never need to apply this knowledge. Just be a nurse from the 60s. That's the only difference. A&P doesn't change a lot. The cell physiology is where it's changed the most in the past decades. And it's important to know how these kind of molecules work. It's important to know. It's like you give out the drugs, they affect these molecules. Like Prilosec, what's Prilosec? It's a proton pump inhibitor. What's a proton pump inhibitor? Well, how come you don't know? You should. You're a student of physiology. This is why like cell physiology is important for even pre-nursing students, right? We all need to know this stuff. And these guys did the work. Well, look at the date of the paper, 1952. Okay, when my mom went to college in the 60s, they still weren't teaching it yet, but we teach it now. It's well known, well understood. This is how you stimulate neurons to fire. It's so basic. Now, if you're a physiologist back then, your goal is to find a model where you can study it. Otherwise, you can't do anything. It's all theoretical. Okay? You heard of a theoretical physicist? They're all math. It's all just on the board. They can't even put it into play. But physiologists, biologists, we never do that. We always like find a model that works. And it's very difficult. I know you guys don't really care about research very much, but if you're a researcher and you're trying to establish these things, finding a model is like betting on the horses. That's what one of my profs told me. It's like you spend decades trying to develop a model and it may not work and you've wasted 10 years. It's literally like that. Research is very slow. These guys, what they did is, okay, we want to find out how cells fire these signals. So I need to find the biggest cell out there. And so they found it in the squid. The squid has a giant axon. Well, it's located here. I mean, you don't need to know where it is, but they found the biggest axon they could find that they could stick their electrodes in. Okay, and, you know, I'll even show you that. So these are the guys that did most of the work. You know, they were able to get electrodes in there and measure this stuff way back then. And you don't need to understand this math. I don't understand it. But the thing to know is that if you can kind of generate an action potential, you have to be able to explain the math. Explain it with math, I should say. If you can't explain the biological waveform you're measuring in the lab with math, you might as well not even publish your paper. Because it's like people are like, well, what is this? Well, I don't know. You need math to explain it. And I don't even understand this math. We're not going to get close to it, but I want you to be able to appreciate it. That's what you got to do. Let's see. Like, you know, for example, you took geometry. What's y equals mx plus b? What is that equation for? A line, right? So that's a simple example, using math to explain a line. This is kind of the same concept. This you do understand. This is from their paper. HH proposed that action potentials in the squid axon is caused by an inward membrane current followed by an outward current, and that currents flow through voltage-gated channels. So you can understand that. What carries the inward membrane current? What ion? Sodium. Carries this one. Potassium. In case you already know that. That's not that. Good, cool. All right, so that's not to say that you guys can't understand that math. Maybe you do. I don't know. I don't understand it. But you guys have to take calculus? You should. Derivatives, integration, differential equations, it's all great stuff. Okay? And you can do amazing things with the math that you learn when you apply it to the sciences. Okay, for us, we'll just kind of look at this curve. I just want to take you through some key characteristics here. First of all, look at this. This is not a teeny-weeny depolarization. Look at the magnitude. Look how big it is. Action potentials are big spikes. Graded potentials, I didn't describe them as big, I described them as teeny-weeny. Okay? I used obvious terms to make it very memorable. These are big. And the thing about graded potentials is they're graded. I said they could be weak, I said they could be strong. Not these. They're all big spikes. And if you get the big spike, you get all of it. Or you get none of it. So that principle is called all or none. Either you trigger one or you don't. It's either off or it's either on, like a light switch. Can your light switch be in between? Well, it can if you have a dimmer. But for a traditional light switch, it's either on or off. Okay, so they're all or none. I said that the graded potentials is like throwing a rock and then the ripples die out. I said they're decremental. These don't die. These are non-decremental. They don't kind of like weaken out as they travel along the axon. They travel vroom, very fast, 200 miles per hour. So it's like they're traveling along. There's your squid giant axon. Maybe you stimulate the cell, you zap it here. You get a spike, I mean, you don't know it. Let's say you put your electrodes right here. Put one there, put one on the inside. You're going to measure it there. And as the signal travels by, vroom, it's like what you see is that as it travels by. So you're just capturing it as it travels by the place you happen to have your electrodes. That's what you're seeing there. So that's why I put a picture of Mr. Axon here. And I'll put the whole cell. But usually we're measuring this in the area of output, the axon, right? Why the area of output? This is the thing that is the output. When the action potential gets the axon terminals, you'll release the neurotransmitter. Okay, that's why we study it. The area of output, that's what the voltage gated channels are. So when you're kind of talking about the key players here, again, to backtrack, our condition of rest was established by the lead channels. Our condition of the graded potentials was established by the ligand gated. These are the big boys, the voltage gated channels. Okay. So you have sodium and potassium. This is sodium. So let's kind of understand. For all voltage-gated channels, it's a change in voltage that opens the gate. That's how they're gated. They have a gate. The gate's usually closed. These channels have two gates. There's an activation gate, and there's an inactivation gate, the ball and chain. And these pictures, based on models that people have put out what they think these things look like, the ball and chain for the inactivation gate is pretty accurate. It's like a little globular protein that kind of plugs it. Okay. Work very well. Like clogging your toilet. Like my kids like to put toys in my toilet. It drives me crazy. I had to call the plumber yesterday. It cost me $230. The guy got the toilet, the toy out of it. This is like that. Like toys still clogging your toilet. They work very well in activating the channel so it can't work. Now, the thing is, these two gates, for the channel to be open, both gates have to be open, right? Because if one of the gates are closed, ain't none coming in. Okay? That's a condition, right? Makes sense. Both gates must be open for there to be sodium influx. if one of the gates is closed, the thing's closed. You'll never have a situation where both gates are closed at the same time. It's not necessary. Okay, both gates open, you get sodium influx. Usually, if it's not open, one of the gates is closed. So notice that on the picture on the left, when this activation gate is closed, they call that the resting state. Rest is a nice word, you know what that is. There's no sodium influx, okay? But this is like where you could stimulate the thing to open. You can stimulate it, okay? And if it does open, that's the middle frame. The middle frame, both gates are open. Okay. This frame, the inactivation gate is closed, okay? And well, they call that inactivation. So when this gate is closed, that's easy to remember. It's called inactivation. Okay, this is like you can't stimulate this to open. You can't.
Can you stimulate it when the activation is?
No. Oh, you can't stimulate it when this one is. You can't stimulate this one. You can't re-stimulate. So I'll make it very clear. Resting state, you can stimulate. I'm trying to write, you can re-stimulate again when you're in the resting state. If you're inactivated, you can't re-stimulate it, this channel to open again, you can't. So it's insensitive, you can't stimulate it. A period of insensitivity in physiology is called like a refractory period, okay? Absolute refractory. That's kind of the fancy physiology way of saying you can't re-stimulate this channel to open again. Absolutely, I agree. Okay, well anyways, the other thing about this, you can't really tell from the still pictures, the kinetics of this, these channels open and close really fast. Moving on, here's the other key player, the voltage gated. The voltage gated, what they do is they got one gate. So they're easier to understand, they got one gate, right? So I'm just gonna change this to potassium, change everything else. Open, close. Potassium channels, the voltage gated potassium channels. One gate. It's either open or closed. If it's open, what it will allow is a potassium efflux, because that's how the gradient has been established by the sodium potassium ATPase pump. We talked about that. If it opens, it goes out. That helps you repolarize or hyperpolarize. Now these respond to the same thing that the voltage gated sodium channels respond to, a change in voltage. They just do it much more slowly. It's their kinetics. So they open and close much more slower, much more slowly. So if you study the action potential, what I did was I put together slides where I threw everything together that I think a student should look at when you're studying the different events of an action potential. Okay. So before I get into the details, basically what you have in a big spike is a big spike. That looks like that. Now a spike has two sides. You got this side, and you got this side. Well, this is over time, right? Therefore, this left side, the side where it like goes up, occurred first. This is millivolts. And what we're going to see here is that this side, which we call depolarization, what does that do to? Something's coming in. Sodium influx. Basically, that's what we see. Okay, so what makes you repolarize on the other side? Yeah, basically, potassium efflux causes the repol. I mean, there's more to it than that. I'll get into the details, but basically that's it. And there's a word called permeability that physiologists love to use. What is the cell more permeable to when it's dipole versus repole? So you have to think of it like I'm going to draw Mr. Axon. Okay, maybe start, finish, axon. I mean, if you're going to get this thing to work, you kind of like get it to the first part. It helps if you think this thing is segmented, like the first segment is at the beginning. You stimulate here. Maybe you start off, you're at rest. You're negative 70 throughout the length. That's rest. Then you stimulate the thing. Maybe you reach the threshold and you fire, and we're going to see you get a real positive thing on the inside there. Stimulate there, positive inside. You get a big spike. Now, you get it there, but it's still negative 70 everywhere else. But this thing is going to propagate. It's going to travel down, and you're going to get, you know, positive in, plus 30, big spike. Okay, well, and I'm trying to say is that during the time that you're letting sodium in, when you're stimulated, the permeability to the cell to sodium is much greater than potassium. So permeability, let me write that word on the board. Abbreviated P. So in this situation, where I'm talking about just that part of the action potential, the part going up, as it propagates, the permeability of the cell to sodium is much greater than potassium. That's kind of the point I'm trying. That's how a physiologist thinks. Is thinking, what is the cell more permeable to? What is it letting in? It's letting in sodium, and that's what allows it to travel. Now, to repolarize, I want to draw the same thing again. The cell is actually going to get really negative on the inside. It's going to get to be like negative 75, negative 80, something like that. It's going to hyperpolarize. It's called negative 90. So again, I'm trying to illustrate the repole. We actually hyperpolarize, so the other side, where you're gonna like kind of get more negative. So during that time, as the thing propagates all the way down, it's kind of hard to illustrate with these pictures. This is a situation where the permeability of potassium is greater than the permeability of sodium. So two ways to think about it. You can think about it as one action potential, dipole, repole, but know that this thing is traveling. Okay, don't get stuck at thinking, oh, just one thing for the whole cell. It travels. Okay, and as it travels, it's doing this. If one side is dipole and one side is repole, you're just seeing it at one location. Okay, so any questions on permeability? This is the basic idea here. What is the cell more permeable to? All right, so what else do I have here on this picture? I have the action potential spike. What's highlighted in purple is the phase of the action potential I want you to talk about. I have pictures of the channels, the voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels. I have pictures of here. This is a double y-axis. This is millivolts here. Permeability is the other axis. It's not labeled there. Okay, so permeability to two things, the yellow and the green. So therefore, what is this yellow curve representative of? Permeability of sodium. And the green curve is permeability to potassium. And so that's how the publisher thinks you should study it. We want you to know that the yellow curve causes the uptick. And then when you repolarize, it's caused by the green curve. That's what they're trying to show you there. I do expect you to understand that. So let's go through the phases of the action potential. It's slightly more than dipole, repole. They start with rest. What does the axon look like when it's resting? Well, it looks like this. Basically, the membrane potential is -70. Right, you got the leak channels going. There's nothing else going on. In terms of the voltage-gated channels, everything's closed. That's what's shown there. They're all closed. That's what I'm writing. They're just all closed. That's easy to understand. Then, look at here. There's just nothing happening. These V-gated channels, they're closed. So their permeability is like, that's why it's like 0. Okay, so there's really nothing happening here. Now, for something to happen, you have to reach threshold. Now they set it at, I don't know if you can see this number, that says -55. See this dotted line? That's what they set as your threshold potential. You must reach it to get the big spike. Okay, so remember, we're saying that that's the graded potentials. So then rest, you want to stem those ligand-gated channels. You want to allow some sodium influx to reach threshold. So it's sodium influx, not through the voltage-gated, the ligand-gated channels. Maybe you reach threshold. Okay, threshold would be to go from there to -55, not plus, sorry. So maybe that's the threshold potential, and maybe that's enough positivity to open the voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay, so if you reach threshold, then you get depolarization. That's what's shown here. So what's happening is you're letting positive in. So imagine you have, I drew this out before, I'm going to draw it again in case you forgot. It was a while ago. Got the doors of the activation gate and then the inactivation gate. What happens is if you let a little bit of positive in, it's all negative here. But if you let positive in from another part of the cell, and it travels to here, what I had said previously was that there's a little positive charge in that part of the gate. Positive charges repel, so that little bit of current there, the negative 55, allows the gate to swing open, that gate to swing open. That allows it to open. That's what's literally happening at the molecular level. That's what's shown there, the gate's open, now that you get the sodium influx. Okay, so that's depolarization. Reach threshold, you get depolarization. The voltage gated channels open. Gated. Now, not all of them open. Some of them open. Remember, I just drew one on the board, but you have like, these are the most densely packed channel in the cell membrane. Okay, and I can't remember the numbers aren't important. What is important is to know that once you allow some to open, you're going to get some sodium influx. Okay, that's more depolarization, more dipole. But that more depolarization opens more V-gated sodium channels to open. And when more open, you get more influx. That causes more dipole. That opens more voltage-gated channels. And you get this rapid, strong, positive feedback loop. So basically, that gives you your depolarization. Now here's the thing. Look at what's highlighted in purple on this inset here. Okay, we're talking about the rise and here. We were at negative 70, but this depolarization is so fast and so powerful. The sodium current from the voltage-gated channels is the strongest current ever. I don't know of a stronger one. And pay attention to your permeability curves. See the yellow curve here? The yellow curve is causing this to open. Comment on the green curve. When the yellow curve is peaked, what's the green curve? It's like 0. It doesn't open to here. The yellow curve is open. The green curve is so slow, it's responding to the same thing. It's just not doing anything yet. Okay, so that's what I want you to understand. This is still closed. All right. So the current is so strong. If it weren't strong, you'd stop at 0. Because what is 0? 0 is equilibrium. But the current is so fast and strong, you actually overshoot equilibrium plus 30. Rapid positive feedback. You over, quote unquote, that's kind of the term that's used, you overshoot equilibrium to plus 30 millivolts. Okay, I mean, it should have stopped at 0. On the video we're going to watch after the break, they say, well, it falls to 0. It doesn't just do that, it actually overshoots it. That's why it's a big spike. You overshoot it and you go to plus 30. Okay, so that's depolarization. I'm going to move on if there's no questions. Yeah.
Does graded potential, does that happen during rest then? Because you said that leads up to this actual potential. So
Yeah, it happens after rest to lead to the threshold,
It's
yes.
kind of in between.
Yeah, in between rest and this is the graded. So to get to here, that's the graded. Okay, well, this one. Okay, repolarization. Just to kind of backtrack to depol, I mean, I think it's obvious, but I'm going to ask the question anyways. Permeability of the cell, sodium versus potassium. And during depolarization, the permeability of the cell to sodium was greater. Okay, I just want to say it, even though I didn't write it previously. Now we're on to repol. So it's going to change. Repol, the permeability of the cell to potassium is going to be greater than. Okay, so a couple of things happen. One is the sodium channels inactivate. That's illustrated right there. So that stops the cell from being permeable to sodium. That's illustrated, okay, when the spike of the yellow goes down, okay? That's one thing. Now look at where the permeability of sodium has now gone to basically 0. Look at the green curve. That is when the green curve is maxed out. So finally, these slow channels, which were responding to the same thing, finally open, okay? The voltage-gated potassium channels open. Basically, that allows the potassium efflux. That allows the membrane potential to repolarize. You return to rest. That's basically what it means. So potassium efflux allows membrane potential to return to rest. That's called the repol. You're repolarizing. You're polarizing again. What's the polarized thing? It's negative on the inside with respect to outside. And that's what we're doing here. So that's what happens when positive leaves. That's basically what you got here. Now, here's the thing about the potassium channels. I said they open slowly, they close slowly too. And you can tell by the waveform of that green curve. Yeah, zoom in on that. I want to try to get you to think about waveforms and kinetics. If something is more spiky, like the yellow curve, that means the kinetics are fast. They open fast and they close fast. It's more like a spike. If something is more like a hill, not a spike, like this, they open slow and they close slow. Look how long it takes for them to close. They're all open and then permeability drops slowly. So during this time when they're closing, there's potassium efflux the whole way, okay? So as long as potassium is effluxing, I don't know if that's a word, membrane potential is going to continue to drop, become more negative, because these are open, they're closing slowly, right? So that kind of causes our last phase, hyperpolarization. Now, before I move on from the repol, are there any questions on this? Closed, open, okay. What did I call the sodium channels inactivated? I use a fancy 2-word phrase. Absolute, that's the first word. Refractory. Okay. Can't get another action potential, basically. All right, so here's the hyperpolarization. Look at what's highlighted in purple. that's what we're talking about, the hyperpolarization. Oops. No. Hyperpolarization, still the same thing. The permeability of potassium is greater than that of sodium. Look at the picture. The sodium channels are still closed, but they're not inactivated. The activation gate is closed. The ball and chain moved. Okay, closed, just like rest. Okay. I gave the analogy of my toilet being clogged with my kid's toy. That's the inactivation gate. What happens if I keep flushing the toilet? It's going to overflow. It can't flush. I can't flush it, but I want to. This is like the guy comes and unclogs my toilet. I'm not flushing it, but I could if I want to, right? This is the resting state, when the activation gate is closed. The toilet's unclogged. I'm just not flushing it, but I could if I want to. Okay. Let's see here. So, hyperpolarization, the sodium channels, they're closed, not going in, they're in resting state. They're not inactivated. You still have potassium efflux because those channels take a long time to close. Still open, still have potassium efflux. Take a while to close. So as long as they're open, it's going to keep leaving. This basically takes you more negative than rest. Okay, that's why it's called hyperpolarization. You're over-polarized, I guess. And so basically they call this the undershoot. Does that make sense? You, quote unquote, undershoot rest. So maybe you go all the way to minus 90 millivolts, something like that. But you don't stay at minus 90. The sodium, potassium, ATP, ACE pump, all that stuff, when the voltage-gated sodium channels finally close, the leak channels and the pump will eventually get you back to rest. Sodium, potassium, ATP, ACE pump, then will basically return to negative 70 millivolts. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the characteristics of the action potential a little bit more. Let's take a 15-minute break.